Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in loving honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz, Olav Hashalom. It's also on the schus and merit of Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, Le'edech Yom V'Shanim Tevis, for many healthy, long years. In last class, we began in continuing the Alter Rebbe's discussion, dissecting the anatomy of a neshama, of a soul. In chapter 2 in Tanya, after establishing that a neshama, Nephesh Hashenis b'Yisrael, the second soul in every Jew, is a chelik elikam emal mamish, with a long analysis that we discussed and elaborated and analyzed the Alter Rebbe's explanation of this. He then qualifies the Alter Rebbe with a question, so then how do you explain the differences from one end of the spectrum to the other of souls? If they're all a chelik elikam emal mamish, and literally coming from the inners, the inside, vayipach ba'apav, nishmas chayim, and memoyach ha'av, like a child that comes from the very mind, the very genetic code, the genetic material of his father, the child. From the very mind of God, kavyachol. So then how are there distinctions between the highest souls and lower souls? As he said, just quickly summing up, and though we find that there are many different levels of soul from one extreme to the other, and he actually explains it. Like the superior quality of the souls of the patriarchs, of the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu, in contrast to the other extreme, al neshamas deresenu ela the ikve Mashiach, over the quality of the souls of later generations, which are called the footsteps of Mashiach, the Ekev, like the heel, in compared to the Reish. So you say Reish B'nai Yisrael are the heads. So it means in the hierarchy of souls, it's like the level of a head. And Ikfayim is the heel, the lowest level. So we see these distinctions, extreme distinctions. And as he continues, and not just in general throughout history, and the same in every generation. Yesh reish alfei rashi alfei Yisrael shenishmesem b'chinas reish v'meach. There are leaders in Israel whose souls are like the brain and the head, figuratively speaking. Visionary souls, if you wish. Compared to the souls of the masses, l'gabe neshamas hamein v'amei haaretz. And then he adds even more, just to really drive the point home about all these levels, as he said, tens of thousands of different levels of souls, one higher than the other. So he says, "V'chein nefoshes l'gabe nefoshes." So too, even when you compare nefoshes, the Nephesh, which in the soul itself, we'll talk in a moment about that a soul has 5 dimensions to it. So even when you talk about nefoshes, in comparison, nefoshes l'gabe nefoshes, this lower level of the lower level of a soul compared to another nefesh, You also find distinctions. So let's discuss and explain, because this is where we stopped last week. So what's the Alter Rebbe adding now? V'chein nefashos l'gabe nefashos. And furthermore, he then says, Ki kol nefesh klula, min nefesh, ruach v'neshama. Every soul contains 3 dimensions, or 3 layers. Nefesh, ruach, and neshama. So this comes to add in the diversity of souls. So let's explain nefesh, ruach, neshama. Truth is, the Medrash says that chamisha shemas nikrula. A soul is called by 5 names. Chassidus, Kabbalah and Chassidus explain that's not just 5 different names for the same level. It's actually 5 dimensions and levels or layers in the soul itself. Nefesh refers to primarily the biological life. When you say nefesh, in general, you can say nefesh means the whole soul. Sometimes neshama, the soul. But when you break it down, nefesh is the biological component. In the language of the Sfiris, nihi, sometimes called body intelligence, functionary, the behavioral. Ruach is the emotional, the emotions of the soul. Chagas, chesed, gvura, teferes. And neshama is the intellectual faculties, referring to chabad, chochma, bina, das. There's also chayin yechida, but it's not relevant here directly, though it does say in Chassidus that bina includes also the gimel rishenish, which would be keser, chochma, bina, keser, which includes chay yechida, but it's not for our discussion here right now. The Alter Rebbe is only mentioning naran. So now that the soul has 5 dimensions, and that's every individual soul. So he's saying, kol nefesh klula, every nefesh encompasses nefesh, ruach, neshama. So a few points Alter Rebbe is saying here. There are many different commentaries that analyze this, but to sum them up, the first thing is, you can say the distinctions between souls is on ruach and neshama. In emotions, there are differences. There are souls that have higher, more elevated, more transcendent, more superior emotional characteristics and personality, and definitely on the intellectual level. Just like we say, der deya. Time of Moshe Rabbeinu was a der deya, generation of knowers, a knowledgeable generation, an enlightened generation. Deya. You don't say that in every generation. But when it comes to nefesh, which is biological, is there really a difference? So he says, no, nefashos l'gabe nefashos is also a difference. So in other words, even the nefesh of a Reishei B'nai Yisrael, of a leader, of a Moshe Rabbeinu, even his nefesh has something that has a superior quality to the nefesh of another type of soul. In addition, it's also telling us that nefashos, even those that live primarily on the nefesh level, there's also distinctions. And why? Key, because the nefesh is klula, nefesh, ruach, neshama. So first of all, the nefashos have a distinction between each other, but primarily key, because the nefesh itself is not a self-contained entity. It has within ruach sheba nefesh, the midas in the nefesh level, the midas in the biological level, and the intellect in the biological level. And as such, that makes further distinctions. So what we see from this is that, sum up, so we see all these distinctions. How do we explain that in the context that it's a chelik elikah mimal mamish? And especially considering elikah is not made up of parts. If something is a piece of godliness, mamish, a piece of God, mamish, and we say God, obviously we don't mean it's God. It means that it has essential divine personality, as we discussed at length in the previous classes. So where's there room for distinctions? And why is this so vital? Because Tanya is meant to be relevant to all of us. Once you make a statement, such a lofty, powerful statement, that every soul, literally every soul, that's how the chapter begins. That's what he says. Nefesh Hashem b'Yisrael chelik elikam mimal mamish. And like he said in the previous chapter, Kol ish Yisrael, echad tzadik ve'echad raza yashtei neshamis. So you're saying everybody. So now we have to understand, because once you hear chelik elikam mimal mamish, you immediately say, okay, That's reserved for great tzaddikim, for the righteous, for leaders, for Moshe Rabbeinu, for the Ovis. And in every generation, the Rosh Bnei Yisrael, the leaders, that have a very special type of soul, the soul to be able to lead, to transcend the mundane world, to lead the rest of the people. But you're saying everybody, Echad Tzaddik v'Echad Rosh has two neshamas. So how do we reconcile that with all these levels that go from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other end, from the head to the heel? So the Alter Rebbe is now going to answer that question. He doesn't ask it as a question, it's more of a qualification. But here is how the Alter Rebbe continues. That despite these vast differences, and they're real differences, it's not just because some people have a nefesh abamis, an animal soul, and they have a bechira, and they chose badly. The nefashas themselves have different levels. And that's indeed one of the reasons that for some people it's harder to fight their animal soul, because the nefesh is not as strong. Sometimes it says the opposite, that kol hagodl mechaveri yitzre godl memenu. A greater person, a greater soul has greater challenges. But regardless, there are actual distinctions in the souls, in levels of souls. So how do we reconcile that? Says the Alter Rebbe, despite these differences, b'kol mokim, nevertheless, sheidish kol hanefesh, the ruach u'neshama, the root of every nefesh, ruach and neshama, as we just explained, nefesh, ruach and neshama, he's not just saying the root of every nefesh, or the root of every ruach, or every neshama. All levels, the root of them all, no matter what level you're on, whether a person is so-called serving God with the basic biological faculties, behaviorally, or someone is serving God also with emotions, or someone is serving God also with the mind, and Chassidus talks about these different levels of serving God. Sheidish kol hanefesh, the root of them all, Mereish kol hamadreges, from the highest level of soul, at seif kol dargin, to the very lowest level, hamalubish beguf, that is manifest and enclosed in the body of Amei Ha'orez v'Kal Shebekalim, found in simple folk and the masses, the irreverent or the ignorant, however you translate it. And again, we're not talking now due to they didn't know better, like a Tinuk Shenishba, but simply people who don't have that same powerful soul, just like you have people who are Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim. You have also Talmidei Chachamim, Yisachar and Zvulun. There are different types of souls. They have different roles. This is not talking about superiority or inferiority. It's simply different levels. It says, but the root of them all, from the highest to the lowest, from the highest of the levels to the very lowest of levels of souls, like it says, Atem Nitzov Mayem Kulchem, Reisheichem Shivtechem, Tilchete Vitzecha V'Shev Meimecha, the heads of the tribes, till the people who are wood choppers and water carriers. Doesn't use that example, I'm just using the pasuk. It says the root of all of them, here's the key. Nimshach memoyach ha'elyen shehi chochmei lo kavyachol. All these souls, without exception, nimshach, they flow or they're drawn from the highest divine level, which is referred to kavyachol figuratively. So it's nimshach memoyach ha'elyen shehi chochmei lo, from the supernal brain, which is also called supernal wisdom. Now we know, like in a human being, there's the brain and there's the mind. Here both are being referred to. Interestingly, when you compare it to what he said earlier, there he said, Nishmas kol ish Yisrael, nimshacha memachshavte v'chachmase yizbarach. But now, he's adding the expression which is more Kabbalistic and more precise in the sources in Eitz Chaim and other places, and Zohar, this is going to be critical because he's going to give an example, back to the example of how a child comes from its father's mind. But it's not just the mind, it's not just the intellect of the father, but also the very brain, the very genetic material of the mind, as we shall discuss. So this, most likely, the Alter Rebbe is saying both expressions because he wants to say that the neshamas are not just rooted in the so-called more ethereal mind, supernal wisdom, but also in the supernal brain. Now, all this is kavyachal, he says, figuratively, because obviously God, when you say mind, our brain, we said earlier, chakim v'lei b'chacham yediyah, God's mind is nothing that we can even understand. But still, the Eibishter chose, as we discussed at length, he chose to manifest in a way that we can relate to it with the example of a father and a child. That also comes from the mind of the father, and that is that the chelik elikam imal mamish, as we discussed, is really higher than all of this, higher than any mind and higher than any intellect and any brain. But nimshach is drawn, it flows through it, so the neshama gets some shape and form in a way that we can talk about it. Chachmosei, moyach, like he says here, moyach elyon, chachmei la. And we discussed this already in previous classes. So now, despite the distinctions, is what he's saying, they're all rooted from the moyach elyon, she chachmei la. Now, this is a tremendous and very relevant message to all of us, because it's telling us straightforward that despite the fact that some souls may be greater and higher than others, and there are actually souls that are higher than others, all of us are rooted in this highest of levels. Now we can also understand and go back to what we discussed, the Hagah and Tanya, where he explained the whole idea of Hum Hu Hamad V'Hu Yedeya, Hu V'Chachmosei Echad, which was so vital, because if you're going to say that the Eibishter is beyond Chachma altogether, so then we're back to square one in a way. The neshama is rooted there, but what about when the neshama comes down below? So we discussed then that Hu V'Chachmosei Echad, according to the Rambam, according to the Ramak, and according to the Arizal, after Tzimtzumim and Atzilus. So now, this is coming extremely relevant now, because now we're talking neshamas no longer as they are all united in their source, like Av Echad L'Kulona, as they are all in the Avinu Shebashamayim, in the source of Chachma, or even higher than Chachma. Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish. We're talking how the neshamas are coming down into a structure and a hierarchy, one soul different than another, and yet it's still all connected to the same moyach, to the same central nervous system, so to speak, cosmic, spiritual central nervous system of the Eibishter's Me'ech Elyon Shechach Me'elah, which we learned before in the Hagah would be Atzilus, as it's meyuchid and connected one with the Eibishter. The Lashon of the Hagah, what he said, the La'achrei, say the Slapshu, say the Ensof, I date Tzimtzumim Rabim, B'kelim the Chabad Atzilus. That there's a unity. So we have here the explanation, as we discussed, of both ends of this story. On one hand, it's divine, and rooted in Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish. At the same time, it comes into Chachmei Law, where it's also united, and from there, it will branch off into different levels of souls. To explain this, the Eibishter actually gave us and created the world in a similar pattern. Kigavna, similar, where how parents give birth to children. And that is now going to be the moshel the Alter Rebbe goes back to. Before he used the moshel just to explain how a child is not like a child and a parent, a child and a father is not like a student and a teacher. The teacher does not create the student. What does that mean? The student is not made of the genetic material or the genetic code of the teacher. The teacher has a mind, the teacher has a whole body, the teacher may have his own children. We're not talking about spiritual, Malamed ben Chavede, that when you teach someone, it's like a spiritual child. We're talking biologically. The teacher has his own mind, the student has his own mind, and the teacher teaches. He's being mamshech eir of seichel. A parent, a father, is not just being mamshech, it's not just a teacher and a student. That very matter of the father's genetic material, genetic code, is carried over to the child. So there's an atzmizdika connection. And that is a moshel in order to understand the connection of a neshama to its father. Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, which is nimshach memoyach ha'elyon shechach me'elah, memoyach ha'av. So earlier the moshel was used to explain the very connection, that fundamental, inherent an intrinsic connection between child and parent. And therefore, neshama is straight connected to the parent. In this case, chachmi Allah, chachmashi is baruch, that Eibishter is one with his chachma. Now he's going to take the mashal further and explain it in detail to help us understand how neshamas can be distinct in many different levels and fundamentally different than one another, and yet fundamentally one and connected to that same moyach. The same moyach ha'elyon, chachmi Allah of the Eibishter. So continues, the Alter Rebbe continues. Kemoshel haben animshach memoyach ha'av. So back to this moshel that we said before. As in the metaphor of a child, born from seed which is derived from the father's brain. And as we explained then from Teira'eh, this doesn't mean physical brain, matter. It means the mind, which controls the flow of the soul, and the very energy source of the soul manifests in the mind, beruchnius, that will ultimately create the actual seed, the reproductive seed that will fertilize an egg, the woman, the mother's egg, that will turn into and conceive a child with the Eibishter's help, the third partner with the neshama that the Eibishter provides. But this is coming from the very genetic code of the father. That was the mashal. So what's irrelevant now to us? You already gave that mashal, but now he's coming to explain. Let's take it further. We said a child comes from that very genetic code. That child comes from the very so-called matter of the body of the parent itself. And that's why you see a child is similar to a parent. There may be differences, but their fundamental connection is a biological and essential one. So what do we see? What does the seed of the father produce? It doesn't just produce a new life, or just a brain, or a heart. It produces the whole child, from head to toe. And the Alter Rebbe goes all the way to the toe, literally, to the fingernails, where even the child's toenails are formed from the very same drop of seed as the child's higher faculties. So this tipa, this semen, the seed of life, within it is embedded the genetic code and the DNA of the parent, of the father. It will not just produce part or the higher faculties of the child, which you can compare in the nimshal to the higher souls. It will also produce all the faculties, all the way down till the very toenails. It's tzipor neiraglov. Why does the Alter Rebbe pick tzipor neiraglov? Because, like we said, akvayim, we went from head to toe, or from head to heel. So he wants to encompass everything by going all the way to the toenails of the child's feet. You're covering the entire spectrum. And it's all coming from the same drop. It's not like different building blocks. From the same tipa. Tipa zu mamish, literally from the same tipa. But how does this happen? Because now the question you can just carry over. How could one seed that doesn't even look like a child, doesn't look like a life, carry everything? And it's coming from moyach ha'av. It originates in the very brain and mind of the father. How does it do that? So there's a process, a gestation process, what we call pregnancy. And the Alter Rebbe is addressing that as well, because he wants to explain not just the neshama as it's rooted in the highest levels, the child rooted in the father's mind, which in Lamaila is connected with the source itself, Hu v'chachma she'echad. But he wants to also explain how it manifests in our existence, in the structure and hierarchy of our existence. So how did that work? How did God do it? He could have, of course, the Eibishter could do anything he wants. He wants a child. He says, father and mother, married in a sacred way, I'll send you a child. No, he wanted a process. Because he wants his child to develop, and he wants diversity and hierarchy. It's part of the structure of existence. So what's the process? So the Alter Rebbe continues. Al yidei sheyosha tisha chadoshim bebet haneim. That this drop, this tipa from the father, originates in the father's mind. How does it develop into a full-blown child? through a 9-month gestation in the mother's womb. He doesn't spell out every step because technically speaking, the seed fertilizes an ovary, the egg, and that develops and conceives a cell. That cell will then continue to split, and through the pregnancy will develop into a full-blown child. But he goes right to the 9-month gestation in the mother's womb, and he says, during which time this seminal drop, it goes down level by level, going down meaning it's becoming concretized, solidified, level by level, that this drop with the egg fertilized, which he doesn't mention, then goes through gestation, like a seed in the ground, developing. But here, the seed doesn't rot. So the seed in the ground is progressively downgraded and transformed to the point that even the nails, the child's nails, are formed from it. And that explains, or at least gives us an example to explain this process. So even though they all originate from the same root, no matter what level, even the nails, the toenails, equally to the very brain or the higher faculties of the child, yet they all come down to, and yet at the same time they develop each one in their own particular fashion. I should say it the other way around, that even though each has their own, how could you compare a toenail to a brain? And yet they all come from the same tipa, but the gestation, the pregnancy, is essentially you want to call it the engine room, the incubator, that develops it and brings it down into a concrete, actual child. And this is the mashal. We're not over yet, but we're going to stop here, because from here he's going to now continue on to say that while it splits through pregnancy into details, but the child is still all originating from one tipa, from the tipa of the Av, which is in the moyach elyon, in the moyach, I should say, of the mind, of the father. And that will continue next week. A good tavach. The archives of these previous programs can be seen at tanyaapplied.com. You can also post any question. Be well and kol tuv.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.